For over 40 years, the Sundance Film Festival has been held on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goju, and Ute tribal nations. We do land acknowledgements to recognize the traditional stewards of this land and our 500 years of resistance to ongoing colonialism. But can we acknowledge the land without listening to the land? Take a moment to really listen. From the Ute to the Wet'suwet'en, from the Anishinaabe to the Kingdom of Hawaii, Indigenous nations all over the world understand that the land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. And we continue to fight for her. Let this land acknowledgement move you beyond symbolic recognition. Let it be your call to action. Support Indigenous resistance. Join us in the fight to protect our mother, for our human and non-human kin, for the next 7 generations.
Hello, hello. Welcome to Calling All Artists. The climate crisis is recruiting. We are so thrilled and honored to be part of the official program at this year's Sundance Film Festival. My name is Mega Agarwal-Sood. I'm based in Colorado, which are the unceded lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne.
Hello, and I am Emily Wanja. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya, and we are part of the Climate Story Unit at Doc Society. Now, the question that keeps us up at night is, have we done everything we possibly can to bring the transformational power of story to the climate crisis at our doorstep? And the truth is, to date, very few artists, filmmakers, poets, painters, and even TV show runners have addressed climate in their work, if at all.
Yeah, you know, Wanja, actually a few weeks ago, you sent me these beautiful words by British Nigerian poet Ben Okri that I'd love to share a snippet with the group today. He wrote, "Faced with the state of the world and the depth of denial, faced with the data that keeps falling on us, faced with the sense that we are on a ship headed towards an abyss while the party on board gets louder and louder, I have found it necessary to develop an attitude and a mode of writing that I refer to as existential creativity. This is the creativity at the end of time." He continues by imploring, "We need a new art to awaken people both to the enormity of what is looming and the fact that we can still do something about it." At Doc Society, we are committed to nurturing a biodiversity of stories as diverse as the ecosystem we seek to save. We know there is no silver bullet story that is going to work for everyone. What we need is a wave of narratives from, by, and about different communities, utilizing all different sorts of mediums and all of our emotions. Stories that can help see new norms and beliefs and germinate visions of a more climate just and safe future. So our goal for today is to recruit you. We are calling on each and every one of you to join us in being part of the solution to the climate emergency.
Yes, and we are joined today by a group of amazing climate leaders who are going to tell you what they want from you and also what they don't want from you as the creative community. And today we have Andrea Ischiu. Andrea, you are a Maya Kish woman, a journalist, a filmmaker. You're a land protector and culture hacker, and also the youngest elected Indigenous community government authority in your township to protect the forests that preserve the watersheds of Guatemala, southern Mexico, and Central America. Thank you so much, Andrea, for making the time to be with us today. And then we also have Gita Prasad. You are a mom, a daughter of the Caribbean, and an assistant professor at the University of Texas. And you are leading a research team that is focused on how climate models can help us plan better for the future. It's such an honor to have you today with us. And then of course we have Vanessa Nakate. And Vanessa, you are a prominent climate justice activist. You are based in Uganda, and you are helping to increase action towards protecting the world's second lung, the Congo Basin rainforest. And you have also just released your memoir, A Bigger Picture, My Fight to Bring a New Climate African Voice to the Climate Crisis. I can't wait to read it myself. Thank you so much for coming through. And then we also have Farhana Yamin. And Farhana, you are an international environmental lawyer and climate change policy expert who has attended nearly every major climate summit since 1991. You are also a participant in the newly released documentary, Rebellion, which documents your journey with Extinction Rebellion. Thank you so much for joining us today. So these leaders will kick us off, and they will kick this conversation. And when we open up to the audience-wide discussion, we want it to be participatory, like juicy, honest conversation, truly. So feel free, no holding back, just put your comments on the chat and your thoughts, and we'll keep having a look as we go along.
All right, let's begin with a quick starter question for the group. Andrea, Geeta, Farhana, and Vanessa, there are currently artists from all over the world who are tuning into this conversation and eager to know how they can lend their talents towards addressing the climate emergency. So our first question for today is, why is now the time for artists to create climate-themed work? And what would you say to persuade them to join this growing coalition? And remember, we're just looking for quick responses with this initial question. Andrea, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invitation to the space. I wanted to say to artists, to people, that it's really urgent and necessary to create narratives that put the life at the center of our conversation. Something that we have been thinking, reflecting, dialoguing with is the urgency that the global North has to learn to listen to the stories that allow life to go on. Story creators must learn to listen before talking any further, and then decide if there's the ability to tell those stories that they're listening to. There's a space that is requested so that so many stories can emerge. Reflection processes on how to avoid reproducing oppression systems from their narrative structures, production models, exhibition, and property is really, really important. It's necessary also that the narratives that put the life in the center awaken the imagination of other ways of inhabiting the planet, of existing without destroying, remembering that everything that guarantees our existence deserves respect: the water, the earth, the air, the fire, the many species of animals and plants, the minerals. So we deserve respect to them in gratitude.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, for opening it up. Geeta, how about you?
Thank you so much for being here. And this is already a really powerful conversation. Why is now the time for artists to be thinking about climate change? I think the reality is that no matter what your art is about, climate change is already in it, because we are all already living in a climate change world. But I think we also have to recognize that art is really critical for helping us build the backbone to take on the tremendous and immediate work of addressing climate change. Art is how we understand and process our lived experience, which is part of why, as Andrea said, it's so important that everybody's lived experience be included in that. But I think if we can reveal the presence of climate change in our art, it'll really give us a way to look climate change in the eye and to really grapple with what it means for the people and the things that we love, instead of, having this sort of vague sense of foreboding, but not really being able to process it fully. And I think we need that more than ever. And art and storytelling is really where that can come from.
Yeah. Vanessa.
Thank you so much. I think that the best time that artists would have gotten involved in the climate conversation would have been decades ago. And I think the next best time is right now. And I think, it's because of everything that Peter and Andrea have said. And also, we cannot have art on a dead planet. We cannot have creativity on a dead planet or storytelling on a dead planet. So I think that there is so much power in using the creativity of artists around the world in centering voices of activists from the most affected areas, in centering solutions, that are needed, or solutions that are already being implemented in different parts of the world. So I think that it would be wonderful if artists around the world understood that this is a global challenge that affects all of us. And if we have a dead planet, then we won't have any more art, and yet we all need a piece of art, in our lives. So while we still have a living planet, let us use art, let us use creativity, let us use everything that we have, to ensure that we can have a more beautiful future for all of us.
Thank you. And for Hannah.
Well, thank you. Such eloquent answers. I guess I would add that in the past sort of 40 years, when science really became, formidably able to predict what was going on, we only used the tools that spoke to the intellect, essentially. We spoke to reason. We spoke to one of our senses, which is the intellect, and we overlooked all of our other senses, especially the heart, and poetry, magic, to films, to culture, to art, to smell, to sound, to taste. None of the other senses were important. We thought we could solve this mainly through science and through law and economics. And I guess I would use the analogy of if climate change was told in music terms, we were only using, the cymbal and the drums, which have got louder and louder, but actually they're really irritating noises. And the louder you play them, just those two sounds, I would say, are law and economics, the more alienating maybe they've become to a very large section of the population. So, involving the full range of instruments, involving the full range of artistic and creative tools is really necessary. And as Vanessa said so beautifully, the best time is now. I wish now, looking back, we'd had an episode of Star Wars, which came out in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when the science reports were coming out. That would have been cool, right? Instead of the asteroid story, which we've got now in Don't Look Up, we should have had an episode or a scene in Star Wars, and that would have been fantastic in alerting so many people all across the world that this epic battle was on our hands, and that it was actually a story that was able to be solved as well.
Yeah. Wow, I can't believe that was just the opening question. I am so excited to get more into this discussion with each of you guys. Each of you have been dedicated to this field of work for years. You've spoken to your communities, to heads of states at international convenings, to your students, your family, your friends. And sometimes it can feel like a bit of a broken record. And, this situation makes us think about Cassandra from Greek mythology, who was cursed to utter true prophecies, but never to be believed. So Vanessa, this first question's for you. Throughout all of your organizing work, do you sometimes feel like a Cassandra? You know how urgent the climate emergency is, but the magnitude just hasn't registered with those who are telling the stories.
Yeah, it's quite very challenging when you can see people experience and you can understand the urgency of the climate crisis, and yet so many people do not understand it. Now, when it comes to maybe people in my community or in my country, still we've had challenges with that, with people saying we are exaggerating the climate crisis, and yet the disasters are evident through the landslides and the floods and the droughts. So I think, one of the things that would help, that always helps us in those situations, is to keep communicating the crisis, to keep educating people and creating as much awareness as possible. Very many people are suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So I think the challenge is in those who don't believe that the climate crisis is happening, those who see that the climate crisis is happening, but they are not ready to help amplify the voices of activists who are speaking up, especially those from, the most affected areas. And again, there are also challenges in activists, finding themselves on certain platforms or finding themselves in certain spaces, but still even in those spaces, their messages are not listened to, their voices are not listened to. So that is really a challenge.
Yeah, no, and thank you for pointing to all those kind of systemic issues that are leading to that. And Geeta, your work is dedicated to creating scientific models that can help inform future climate mitigation strategies. How do you deal with the frustration of knowing things that others just don't want to hear?
Yeah, I share Vanessa's frustration. I think they're huge communities that have been yelling this from the rooftop forever. And, maybe some of us are doing it with drums and some of us are doing it with cymbals and some of us are doing it with French horns, and yet somehow it's still not being heard. And I think a really important thing to recognize is that it's not that, we're making all this noise and it's not registering with people. We have to recognize that it's being actively drowned out by those who benefit from the status quo. There's someone over there with the bullhorn who wants things to stay the way that they are. And so I think it's really important for anyone who feels like climate change isn't urgent, or that it won't be damaging, or that it's not worth investing our resources in fixing right now. I really encourage them to question where that information is coming from. Where are they getting that message? Who told you that? And why do they want you to think that? Is it in your best interest? Is it in the global community's best interest? Or is it in their best interest that you believe that? And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we feel like Cassandra, to recognize that there are forces other than us who have been creating this silence chamber for so many people.
And so to your point, Geeta and Vanessa, it brings us to the next question, because when we look at some of the most popular climate stories of the past decade that have dominated the media, we acknowledge that they're very global north centered in who is telling the story and in how the story is getting made and how the story gets shared. And so I'm going to ask you, Andrea, do you feel like the stories you see about your region, do you feel that they reflect how you and your community experience climate change?
Yes, there is a story of inequality also, not only in representation in cinema, but also in the exhibition, distribution, processes, and spaces. Indigenous communities had been creating movies, documentaries since 1970s, but we're not never exhibited in these biggest halls and these biggest cinemas and these biggest theaters. So I have seen many movies that reflect my communities and other communities, but those are not the stories that are being shown and put in these big platforms when you need to pay just to watch art, right? So that inequality also makes inaccessible a lot of the arts and the films that have been created. I have been part of Indigenous filmmaking collectives since I was a teenager. So I have seen plenty of stories. I had organized Indigenous film festivals in my community and in Latin America. So there's a problem also with all the inequality about accessing to certain platforms just to have global exhibitions. So I think it's that part also of the conversation. Also the gatekeepers around these big, platforms that and how and who can have access to them. So part of that inequality is why a lot of people doesn't know a lot of the Indigenous filmmakers, of the filmmakers that are coming from other parts of the world that are telling other stories that are prolonging the end of the world. So I think that's why it's really important to say that what I have seen sometimes in, you know, the mainstream platforms are not reflecting my community. But the stories that are reflecting my community are somewhere else. We're projecting it on our streets. We're projecting it in our community. We're projecting it in, you know, we put it on, you know, other streaming platforms that we have created and programmed with our hands. I have seen amazing films made by my own friends that we have grown up together, and they're telling the stories of with the complexity of living in an indigenous community in the 21st century, you know, telling the stories about getting in love in times of capitalism. We're creating stories right now of how to defend the earth in times of pandemic. All these films, all these movies have been created right now by people that are around us. So it's really important to, you know, sometimes work a little bit on finding those stories that are reflecting your community. Find your local, your neighbor, movie maker, you know, cinema collective that is creating stuff. It's really important to create an open spaces for them. But what I am a bit tired of listening and hearing is all these state-centric narratives, which place all hope of change in the decision of the rich and powerful. The narratives of fear and that the end of the world is the limit of our imagination. The narratives that are reinforcing the colonial, racial, and capitalist and patriarchal systems of oppression. Those are the stories that I am a bit tired of listening, hearing of everywhere. So those are the stories I'm all the time running away from. And that's why I actively engage in creating spaces for other stories.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I know we're probably going to have a question that will tackle one of the points you just raised later. But for now, I'm going to follow up with you, Vanessa. Do you feel, or what would you say you feel is missing from the stories that are being told about climate change across Africa?
I think what is missing are the voices from Africa, because there's so many activists across the African continent who are speaking up, who are organizing, who are mobilizing, who are not just doing climate strikes, but providing solutions in their communities. There's so many activists working to provide water for their communities, to provide skills for women empowerment, to provide skills for girl child empowerment, you know, to provide trees to be planted in homesteads. These are things that are being done by very many young women, very many young men across the African continent. But you wouldn't know that from the news. You wouldn't know that from anywhere, because they are not being platformed, they're not being amplified, and their stories are not being told. So I think the missing thing here, or the missing people, are the activists themselves. And it's really important, if we tell our own stories, if we tell our own experiences, and if we talk about our own solutions. The fact is that we don't need new solutions. We have solutions in our communities, and we are working on those solutions. So it is time for, you know, the world to pay attention to what the activists from the most affected areas are saying.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Vanessa. You know, we discuss a lot with our community about how climate justice has to be centered both in our storytelling and our advocacy practices, that we can't address the climate crisis by telling stories that deepen existing injustices or that amplify oversimplified solutions. You know, the next theme that we want to touch upon that Andrea started to mention during our last question is, you know, talking about these different types of climate narratives that we're just so tired of hearing. And so for Hannah and Geeta, this question is for you. What are the climate narratives that you are just so tired of and that just need to stop being shared now? For Hannah, we'll start with you. And remember, no need to hold back.
Well, thank you. I guess there are three things that I think would really pivot us to different, more diverse and more equitable set of solutions and peoples. And I would say shift from talking about the future. Climate is always framed as a future problem. It's not. So shift to the past, shift to talking about the past, locate yourself in the present and how you got here. And through that simple shift, you will begin to connect with our own histories, which are complex and which have resulted in, you know, nature being decimated for hundreds of years as a result of, you know, very deep systems which cannot be tackled, you know, through the market now alone. So through that one shift, focus on the past, not on the future, and change that in all our climate stories and dialogues. Focus on justice and not on emissions. We tend to look at climate as a very emission-centric, you know, supply-centric problem. Actually, if you look at its impacts and you look at justice and you look at who is emitting and who's impacted, you will get a nuanced and much more balanced and much more inclusive picture. And number three, I think shift from the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, that acronym that we're all so familiar with, shift to community. So community is the new COP. Community is where we locate ourselves. And so, you know, and I'm guilty as well as everybody else. I spend a lot more time now on who is my community, locally, as well as through my identities, my many identities, and not just at these UN summits and these state-centric systems as pointed out. So I think by creating this shift in our own vocabularies, in our own mindsets, in our own theoretical systems, we will get to the diverse solutions that Vanessa and Andrea and Geeta have talked about, because you will start to platform and see, actually, there are many, many peoples, there are many, many cultures, there are many different systems that are already protecting nature, that are already providing solutions to climate, that are already here in the here and now, got what it takes to solve this problem. And it is a problem that involves everyone. So everyone has to be included in that. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Amazing. Thank you for those three shifts for Hannah. And how about you, Geeta? What are the climate narratives that you're saying no more to?
Well, I have a pick that's maybe a little bit controversial. And I think the narrative that I've heard recently that's really started grating on me is this idea that we only have 10 years to save the world. And let me tell you why I find that a little bit grating. I think one issue is that it gives the impression that if we don't do it in 10 years, then it's not worth it. And, you know, I think it's really important that we recognize that it is always going to be worth it to do whatever we can to make things better. You know, I think having that kind of cliff makes it easy for pessimists or for people who prefer the status quo to sort of throw up their hands and say, well, that's impossible, so let's not even try. And then I think there's also the flip side of it, where when you put 10 years on it, that means we have 10 years to get serious. So we can kind of wait out the clock for the next 10 years. But I think one of the most important things is that it perpetuates this idea that solving climate change is going to be a one and done thing. And I think it's really important to recognize that we're going to keep making decisions that affect the climate that we live in. And so what we really need is to create a more inclusive and just and thoughtful system of institutions and legal and economic frameworks. We need to resource the communities that are already doing the work and bring them more into the center so that we can transform our entire way of behaving as a world so that we can sustainably approach our impact on the climate system. So I think it's really important to make sure that our narratives present urgency, because urgency is necessary, but we can't use that to push through unjust solutions that are going to perpetuate existing systems of power and inequity. And I think we have to remember that we will always have to do the most that we can to protect our climate system, starting yesterday and continuing forever, not just, you know, in 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Geeta, for that. Andrea, actually, I'm coming to you because it just feels like we are just tired of hearing stories that are rooted in something that you mentioned earlier, which is either fear or hope. And we like to think that as humans, we are much more dynamic than these two emotions, right? Where are the stories that evoke joy, courage, curiosity? And why is climate missing, even in romantic comedies, in soap operas, in telenovelas, or even in Bollywood, blockbusters. And so, Andrea, I come to you because you have helped to start an initiative called the Hackeo Cultural, and your team defines culture hacking as making common sense out of radical ideas, building insurgent open source narratives, and defending life and territory, dismantling systems of oppression, one meme at a time. And also, long live free culture and kitty GIFs. So could I ask you then to share an example of creative storytelling that you have found to be powerful and effective?
Well, I first wanted to add about the narratives.
Yes.
I am sick of the narratives of let's save the planet, right? I am tired of that because there's no sense of responsibility of the role that we daily may have on that. And that doesn't allow us to point the fingers on the biggest responsibles. And also that points the responsibility only in your individual actions. So I think that's really important to rethink, reframe, and also decolonize the narratives around the climate crisis. It's something about stop exterminating the systems, stop exterminating the lands, the forest, it's stop exterminating indigenous communities, African territories. That's something that the people needs to start thinking more on than just saying, let's save the planet by buying greenwashing. And I think it's also part of a conversation of how are we framing the climate crisis? Because it's really important to tell the story of the crisis as a symptom, not as a disease. And it's also important the intersectional storytelling of the climate crisis that also frames the structural inequalities, as Farhana says, and name the responsibility on the climate crisis proportional to the privileges. I think that's really important. It's part of the reflection that we have been doing with our compañeros of Hackeo Cultural. So if you want to check some creative storytelling around this, I can invite you to go to the page Cura da Terra, which is a narrative that we begun together with a lot of indigenous women from different regions of the world to talk about the cure in times of pandemic and in times of climate crisis. What are the cure? What is the cure of the earth?
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, Andrea. Mega, what do you think? Shall we throw it to the floor, just either to Gita, Vanessa, or Farhana, any one of you? You can just share any example of creative storytelling that you have found powerful or effective. And by the way, for the audience, feel free also to just drop in the chat any work that has been inspiring you or you have found effective at any one point. Who would like to go? Yeah, Farhana.
So one of the things, I love documentaries, but they only reach a certain part of the population. And we do have to have blockbusters, we have to have films and telenovelas and dramas and plays in all sorts of languages, as well as performed in schools. So this is a really important thing that we've been missing. Music from musicals that I did when I was like 9 or something. We need all of those. And I loved one of the examples that last year or the year before I became aware of, which was in Brazil, a 10-part drama series following 3 activists, women activists actually, called Aruanas. And I was really taken with it. I could only watch some of it, some of the 10, and I thought, brilliant, here I am, Netflix obsessed generation. I just want to sit and binge on following, the stories of corruption, of politics, of blockage, all the reasons, why we haven't heard the urgency of the climate crisis and why we haven't seen all the amazing solutions. And we have to understand that the vast majority of climate literature and films, documentaries are in English. They still are in English, and most of the world does not speak English, So we have to remember much more ordinary means of communication that are a little less glamorous, like radio, which reaches everyone, podcasts, all the rest of it. Actually, we need to understand that our technologies are giving us a huge opportunity to tell the many different wonderful stories and solutions in many different ways. So I would like to recommend those.
Yeah.
Geeta.
I'm getting really excited to hear all of these recommendations. I'm going to get a running list of new Netflix things to watch and non-Netflix things. I just want to highlight two examples of creative storytelling that I've found really powerful recently. So there's an organization called Climate Central that does a lot of science communication around climate change. And one of the things they've utilized is visual storytelling about the climate future. So sort of virtual reality of what different places will look like under different climate realities. So for example, what San Diego will look like in the next 75 years with sea level rise if we don't cut emissions. And I think that's really powerful because climate change up until recently has felt like something far off for many people, especially in the global north. And that kind of storytelling is really vital for bringing it home for people that might feel like it's not something that they have to think about right now. And because, we can't wait until every person is feeling the effects of climate change to act. By then it will be far too late. And these modes of sort of virtual reality and visual storytelling, I think, are really a valuable way of bringing in people who are maybe ambivalent or feel aloof to the whole situation. But the other example that that I'm actually reading right now is a collection of stories called All We Can Save that's curated by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson. And I have it on my bedside table right now. And it's this wonderful juxtaposition of it's all women writers. It's a combination of scientists, legal experts, Indigenous experts, activist community, poets, people coming from all different sectors who are thinking about climate change. And there are many times reading it that it's just brought tears to my eyes, because I think seeing all of those ways of thinking about climate change next to each other can be a really creative way of storytelling, because like Farhana was saying, it really excites all of your senses at once, and you start to see how the dry information about climate change that you see in the news connects with our really visceral feelings about the people and places that we love that you read in a piece of beautiful poetry. And so that storytelling has been really resonating with me.
Yeah, these examples are just so powerful in illustrating that these stories exist, right? It's not that there's a shortage of these stories. And I think to Andrea's point earlier, it's about structurally also recognizing that there's a reason why these stories are not actually reaching the audiences that need to be engaged and be part of the conversation. And what that's resulting in is that we're losing the cultural battle, right? Due to a swell of also really patronizing narratives, of a lot of misinformation, a lot of technocratic language. And what we really hope is, needing artists to help create, Andrea, as you said, like radically imagine the world that we want to live in. And so this next question is for Farhana and Vanessa. As you think about the communities that you're organizing with, what is this vision of a more climate just and safe future that you are mobilizing your community towards? Farhana, you want to start off?
Yeah. So I think nature is abundant and provides plenty. The earth, still in its ecologically diminished form, has massive resources: water, food, forest, biodiversity, even in this diminished point that we find it. And it can also recover and has massive resilience. We saw a few months of COVID and an economic lockdown, and nature flourished and revived. So my vision of a more just world relies on shifting these values, shifting the stories that have been normalized over centuries, that nature is insufficient, that only technology and markets and factories and manufacture and all of those in a concentrated and bigger form will provide for us. This is wrong. This is just plain wrong. We also have to shift away from this technocentric extractivist economy to the gift economy, to the kindness and compassion-based economy, and to know that actually people and human beings are kind at heart, and that is our kindness and generosity and social conscience, which are our defining values that help save us. and that help, help us all flourish. And this storyline of competition, dog eat dog, that if you really are smart, you're going to just look out for yourself, and maybe you'll save your family, and maybe you'll save your, next of kin, or your clan at the very most. But that trying to save everyone is naive and idealistic. We have to shift all of those very toxic stories that basically underpin the modern capitalist economy, which makes us not care.
Yeah. And how about you, Vanessa?
Yeah, thank you. I think that I'm more just wowed. To me, I think it's really about respecting cultures. It's really about respecting identities. It's really about respecting communities and respecting people's stories, and also to think about, the solutions that we call just, or the solutions that we call eco-friendly, and to really think about these solutions, who is benefiting from some of these climate solutions, who is getting hurt because of these climate solutions, and why are they the ones getting hurt? And if people have to purchase some of these solutions, at what cost? Why are some communities getting some of these solutions at a high cost? And why are other communities getting some of these solutions at a low cost? So I think these are some of the things that we can think about, to think about things like procedural justice. And this is about involving communities, involving people, in some of the decisions, most of the laws that are put in place, for environmental protection. Sometimes laws are put in place without inquiring from the people in those communities. So I think that it's important that if solutions are, to be implemented in communities, that they have the voice, that they have the hearts of the people, that we can have a certain kind of recognition, justice, to recognize communities that have been impacted in the past and why they were impacted. So I think it's really a very big thing to think about, for people to just look at the history and to look at what we can do now, and if what we can do now to ensure that it is not harming or it's not increasing more injustice. Because in implementing climate solutions, you can still exacerbate already existing, climate injustices. In talking about, provision of solar technologies, it could mean, continuous child labor in certain communities, or continuous women's rights or girls' rights being violated in certain communities. Talking about planting trees, millions of trees as campaigns, and yet it means a certain community somewhere is going to lose their land, which is their culture, which is their identity. So I think that justice should really come in. It should really come in a package of looking at the history and looking at the future that we want, but also looking at who could lose their identity because of specific climate solutions. So justice is just really respecting people's cultures, people's, identities, protecting people themselves, and also respecting the planet and, the biodiversity and the ecosystems in general.
Wow, thank you so much for Hannah and Vanessa for just sharing that so clearly and just so beautifully. Which brings us to the last question, which everyone will get a chance to answer. And we're going to do it in the rapid fire style, like we did the first question. And we're asking, what do you need from the creative community right now to advance your work? We're going to start with you, Andrea, then we'll go to you, Farhana, Gita, and then Vanessa.
Thank you. As I said at the beginning, the capacity of listen, because we need storytelling that conjoins past and present, that can be able to expose the ongoing violence that affects people, but also along with the ways in which we make life persist. I think it's really important also to have sites of the colonial education, and that's why storytelling and film festivals can contribute to the formation of a decolonial attitude, by which at larger audiences can be able to take up the task of committing themselves to the unfinished process of questioning social and internalized colonial legacies, and to define a course to action accordingly to that. So that might be a call.
Thank you, Farhana.
But I guess for me, you know, we're at the all hands on deck. We need everybody now, because this 400-year cycle, when capitalism and imperialism and racial injustice, which is at the heart of it, took root, is coming to an end. I feel it's already ended. And actually there's much to celebrate, as well as the stories to tell. And that 400 years ago, basically white men were the main architects, or that's the story we've been told. They were the main chief architects, and they were valued the most. So we have to stop and question now and platform and prioritize all of the other actors who 400 years ago did not count as human beings. Women did not count as a full human being. Young people did not count in a very diminished legal sense. You know, Black people, Asians, whether you were lesbian and gay and had a different gender identity, you did not count 400 years ago in most cultures. You were not considered fully human. And for now, for me, the biggest thing to question and ask our artists to do is, what does the world look like with all of these identities? If they're valued equally, if all the different cultures that they're part of are valued equally, what does the world now look like? What does the economy look like? What does our politics look like? What films are now needed? What stories need to be told? What pictures are painted? What novels are written? I don't know, but I know that that's the deficit that we need to address very, very fast. And it is being addressed. And largely it's now shifting the mainstream to incorporate that full diversity. And we're at the sort of beginning of that journey, and it's already lovely and fascinating. So it's a good time to start telling more diverse stories.
Thank you so much, Farhana. Gita.
Yes, I think we need, from our storytellers, we need positive visions of the future. We need to see what a future where we have succeeded in building a sustainable and just climate look like. Because I think without that, people disengage or they resist change, and we need everybody engaged and participating. So I think people need storytelling that convinces them that there's another way, right? They need a vision of the wonderful thing that they're running towards, not just the terrible thing that they're running from. So, what does the best version of 15 years from now look like? I think we need storytelling that shows people that future.
Thank you, Gita. Vanessa.
I think that I would just add on what Peter said. I think I would also love for the storytellers to show us, to make us, have an imagination of a better world, of, a more beautiful world, and to show us that it's, not only necessary for us, but it's also possible. Because in this, I know that even the people who are organizing or who are mobilizing, they receive a certain kind of hope, to a certain kind of hope for that future, a certain kind of faith for that future, a certain kind of love and excitement, for what they are fighting for. So I think that I would love to see more of that kind of world that we all want.
Oh. Andrea, Geetha, Vanessa, Farhana, thank you so much for joining this conversation and sharing such beautiful insights and visions of the present and the future that we can all move forward towards. Let's open up this discussion. Can everyone do me a kindness, switch on your cameras, wave hello, and let's have a chat together.
Hello, hello. Hi. It's so good. It's so good to see everyone. And I just want to make a note that Vanessa Nakate has just had to sign off because it's midnight in East Africa. So we want to ask you something. After having heard that incredible conversation, we are curious to know, how are you feeling at this moment? Just tell us in one word, just drop it in the chat. Tell us how you're feeling now. And if you need some inspiration, we have the feelings wheel. I don't know if you can see it properly, but just type in the chat how you're feeling. Mega, would you like to say how you're feeling now?
Oh my goodness. I was so energized after that conversation. I just had to move. I switched some energy and wow. And also I just feel so generative. I feel like I'm just ready to start creating and talking and listening and really, really listening. It just, yeah. Wow. I'm still buzzing and processing from all of that goodness that was just shared.
Yeah, that resonates. I feel inspired, a little bit anxious, but I do feel inspired. And I even see from the chat where we're getting ready, we're getting hopeful,
empowered, invigorated, buzzing, fired up. I love it. Proud. Oh, that's so good.
So then the other thing we're going to ask you to do for us is we want to get a sense of who's in the room today. So if you are an artist or storyteller, could you just raise a hand emoji? Yeah, you can raise your hand, or you can just put in your the hand emoji.
Yeah, you can raise real hands too.
Yeah. We just want to see. Oh, yay, awesome. And then if you have worked on a climate-themed story, could you then go ahead and then put a heart emoji on the screen? Yay! Oh wow. My God. Oh, look at all the heart emojis. Yes. Thank you.
What an incredible community to be a part of. When I think about this week's Sundance Film Festival programming, I just feel so joyful thinking about all the richness and the range of climate-themed stories that are going to be premiering this week. We have everything from feature docs to fiction films to VR. We'll be adding some names and titles in the chat of all the climate-themed stories that are premiering at Sundance. Please check them out and also send the team some love. As many of you know how hard it is to be telling these stories, but also just how important it is. Also, I am so grateful and excited to be sharing that we have a little bit of a treat for everyone today. Joining us live is prominent activist from Brazil, Negina Cardoso, who is also a participant in the featured documentary, The Territory, which premieres tomorrow evening. The Territory is a film that follows the Uruguay Wow Wow Indigenous surveillance team as they defend their land from a network of Brazilian farmers. Negina, oh, it's so good to see you. We have a few questions for you. First off, thank you so much for the work that you do and for joining us today. Our first question for you is, how has today's conversation resonated with you? And is there anything that you'd like to build or comment upon what was already discussed?
All right. Good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where you are. It's good evening in Brazil, right? Well, to listen to you was so interesting because the territory is taking away from an invisible spot all of the history of activism in the Amazon, coming from indigenous peoples as well from activists in general. And it is a film that has the standpoint that we have. It is our perspective. So listening to all of you, and Fahad, I think it was Fahad, I was very impressed, Fahana, I was very impressed because it really felt like it was us. in the film, in the movie, it is our spirit, our poetry, and our fight. Because to fight is also poetry. And the four women that we had on the panel today impressed me, because each one of you is a part of us here from the Amazon. And if you watch the territory, you'll see that you have our perspective, our gaze, our culture, what we've been doing, and it is our voice. It is our voice from the Amazon, and not other people talking about us, or it is us. So the four of you, when you spoke, I really felt touched. It really touched my heart, my soul, my spirit. I wish I could hug you. I really wish I could. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And Nadina, one additional question for you. How do you envision that the territory will be impacting the work that you do?
Well, I hope it will have a tremendous impact. We have 40 years of our fight for the Amazon there. It is really interesting that we're a wild people. It's a small people, and a land that is considered to be large, 1,167,000 hectares, almost 2 million hectares. There could be several countries there. And it is a small people defending the Amazon. And the images, the footage from the territory was partially really produced by the small people that Alex, Will, Gabriel, the producers really had the opportunity, gave them the opportunity to learn how to record. And our spirit is there. There's more there than only a film. I don't remember who said, someone said something about really having a movie be made by the community. And this is what this film is all about. It's a movie made by the community with our perspective, with our view from the indigenous people and from the activists. So I really do hope there will be an impact. And I don't know if I can say this, but I'm going to say this. We need to change this bloody government we have in Brazil, because it is a government that is destroying the indigenous people. It is a government that is destroying the Amazon. It is a government that is really destroying our souls. And I really do hope that this film will help people have that perspective, and that the whole world will support us in this fight so that we can step away from invisibility, and so that the Amazon can be seen from the people that inhabit the Amazon. And this is what the movie is all about. It's our perspective, our soul, our spirit.
Thank you so much, Nadina. And, in addition to the story being such powerful storytelling, we also commend the team for the participatory, collaborative nature of how the story was being told. And, and to your point, I know it's a very important election year in Brazil. And so we are all very eager to see and also to support what is happening on the ground. Big virtual hugs to you, Nadina, and all of us are really excited to be joining the premiere tomorrow evening. Thank you again so much for joining this conversation.
Muito obrigada a todos.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Nadina. It's an honor, truly. I also am looking forward to experiencing this breadth of stories at the festival. And I have to admit, though, that when I first started to learn about climate change and how I can get involved, I only knew very basic aspects of it, and even much less on how to articulate or even talk about climate in the context of, say, justice or policy, or even how these things end up being interconnected. In short, I was intimidated by the sheer magnitude and complexity of the subject, and I did not know exactly how I could contribute to the movement or if I even had what it takes. And so I just wanted to ask, has anyone here had a similar experience? Would you say that maybe some of this has been holding you back from creating a climate story. And I'm going to reach out to you, Thimali, because you are in the house. Would you like to share? Does any of this resonate?
Oh, you can hear me. It's talking late. Hear me, sorry. Yes, so I think it does resonate a lot. I am the series producer and co-host of a project called Mothers of Invention, which is a Doc Society project, a podcast on feminist solutions to the climate crisis. And like you, Wanja, I didn't know barely anything I knew about climate change before I started working on the show. And it was, feel a lot of imposter syndrome around that. But thankfully, I was working with Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, and she quite famously talks about how she knew very little about climate when she was the president of Ireland and also as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so it really sort of emphasized that we all arrive when we arrive with whatever talents and faculties we have available to us. And the important thing is that we just get to work immediately. So, since then we've pushed out 3 seasons. I was just at COP actually, and participated in one of probably the only conversations about art and climate in the entire conference. I think I can plot that in the chat as well, if folks are interested. But it's just to reflect back what the guests were saying, which was so impressive. I brought up this point that the right has their vision of the future and it tends to be the past, and moderates tend to have a vision of the future and it tends to be the status quo. But we as, more on the progressive side of the spectrum need to be able to visualize what happens next. And it's really art and artists that can do that. And, at a time of the rise of fascism and growing disparity, art is a kindness and a meditation, and it's something we all really, really desperately need right now. So that's my general feeling on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Thimali, for sharing that. Wanja, I think it's time. This chat has been on fire. There are so many reflections and so many questions. I want to just share a couple of reflections and then actually ask a question to the group. There is huge love for the comment from Farhana about community is the new COP, and that there's a lot of love for the idea that we need a new story to believe in, one that can replace the harmful myth of eternal economic growth, making us all rich and happy. And also loving the idea that storytelling conjoins past and present. Brenda and the chat from Sundance shares reminds me of the way that our own Tabitha Jackson at Sundance talks about documentary as a time machine. So actually this next question is from Nicole Betancourt. Could we call Nicole up to the screen, please?
Am I on?
All right.
Can you see me?
We hear you. Go ahead,
Okay.
Nicole.
Okay. Oh, there I am. So what comes to mind a lot is at the forefront for me creatively around climate change right now or climate crisis, however you want to describe it, is grief. Is that there's so much that we're losing. And I feel in my culture, I'm in New York City, that there's not a lot of space for grief of any kind. I mean, from COVID, from AIDS, from, all the various crises we've experienced. And I sort of long for that space. We recently created sort of a climate memorial in a community garden called The Unfixing. You can see it online. And it was more powerful than I imagined. I feel that, for me, that grief is such an important part of love. It's an expression of love. And so I'm curious for the panelists, like, why is there this resistance to grieving for what we're losing? And Have they seen work that was inspiring around that? And how do we hold space for that in a way that helps us move through it instead of remain stuck in it, I guess?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, for that beautiful question. I'd actually really love to bring up Andrea, one of our speakers who thinks a lot about creating these types of spaces, and to see which reflections she has for Nicole's question.
Very much. Well, what we call cure, the cure of the earth, the cure of our bodies, the cure of our spirit, we call the healing of the earth and the defense of the life and our territories. And we see our bodies also as territories. So the first thing is really important to allow the grief, allow the pain, and also feel it. You know, honor all that loss too, because it's part of the existence. But we know also when we are creating collective narratives that the end, the death, it's not the end. It's a cycle, and the life is a cycle, and the end is a part of that big long cycle that has always existed. So it's really important to think on that, to allow the grief, but also to think on the healing processes that are really needed in our individual and also in our collective, in our community. So part of the possibilities of listening and building solidarity, you know, this pandemic has shown us that solidarity is the health of the people. The hegemonic narratives hide solidarity among those below and promotes vertical and unequal solidarity. We must pay special attention not to strengthen the solutionism or the technological capitalism, intervene in this charity discourse, and that it's really important to promote the participation of the individual, but for the common good, the community health. The mind, family, your family are important, or health are important. The power of the collective and the common are the antidote for the hyper-individualization that sustains these systems. And it's really important to weave narratives to promote other ways of measuring well-being, where my health depends on the health of others, where the interdependence between people and territories is shown. So solidarity is part of our humanity, and it's not an institutional discourse. The history reminds us that in these moments of crisis, the solidarity, the mutual liberation transforms into responsibility, generates structural changes.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And then we're going to take one more question from Vanya. Vanya, if you could just come up and you have a question on stories about crisis told with dark humor, would love to hear from you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to ask this question. Well, recently, and for everybody who has Netflix knows, Don't Look Up was released recently, and I felt right as at the end of 2021 that was a great film to come out, because it just felt like it spoke to so many different audiences. I was able to see it with my family and with my friends. So I would just love to ask for a comment on what do you feel like that specific Hollywood blockbuster film, what kind of impact does that have on so many audiences worldwide, and how can we influence the creation of these kind of films? And Hollywood, as Farhana said recently, that not just documentary can have that kind of impact.
Yeah, thank you, Vanya, for asking that question. And we will encourage you just to type any suggestions or any comments you have to that. But in the meantime, shall we call on Gita? What do you think about that question and the comment by Vanya?
I have to admit, I would actually love to hear Farhana's take on this, because she had some very spicy ideas about it in our earlier panel conversation. Yeah, but I think one of the themes that came up, and then I really will turn it over to Farhana because I'm excited to hear what she has to say, but the idea of the doom at the end of that movie, and I have to admit, I haven't seen it yet, but I have gotten the spoilers for it. I think the doom at the end of it is one piece that really needs to be pushed back against. And I think, you know, coming back to the theme that came up in our conversation earlier, the having a positive vision for the future. And a friend of mine actually recently mentioned, what if we had a movie that didn't even center climate change in its vision of the future? It was about something completely different, but just in the background, we saw this better world where we had solved climate change. I think telling those stories, making it integral, but doesn't even have to be central, can just make it second nature to us to think about that better future. But now I want to hear the spicy take from Farhana.
Farhana, the floor is yours.
Well, I have seen it, and as I said, the more the merrier. You know, we need more films of all kinds, and I guess, you know, in Hollywood, dystopia is the dominant norm, and you know, individuals sort of fighting their way, sometimes being able to vanquish the evil and flourish is okay. And more often than not, we're seeing this dystopia, which I think plays into the hands of those who essentially have already given up. And it sort of feeds a kind of apathy and a lack of imagination and choice about how to design our future. And I guess there was another question that someone asked about, if you're not an artist, what can you do? Well, you know, we all have imagination and we all have agency. And when you're a young child and someone asks you to write a story, you know, yeah, as a young child, you just spout forth, you know, you can write hundreds of pages and you can talk for hours. And when you become an adult, you know, having and activating and talking with imagination about something is seen as suspicious, and we suppress it. So the more that I think we imagine different possibilities, the more we speak to people who have already been resisting, who have already been living a different kind of reality, the better. So that's what I would say. And in relation to the film, yeah, I find that ending, you know, sorry, it is a bit of a spoiler alert for Geeta, you know, really just really excruciatingly annoying, because it is like giving up at the end. It's, you know, the final meal, it's game over. And that narrative is rarely spoken by the people and the countries and the vulnerables that I work with. They are never going to give up. They can't give up. There is no question of giving up. And there is still joy in the work that they do. There is joy in resistance. There is joy in community. There is joy in solidarity. And I've got here, you know, and I'm holding it. I don't know if it can show up. It's Joanna Macy's work, which starts with honoring the pain, seeing with new eyes. Here, I'll hold it up. It's a really beautiful one, probably not very good, so I'll share that. But, you know, going forth, so allowing our pain and acknowledging it is very important to design, you know, and be okay with grief as a friend that we'll have to walk with, given how much destruction there already is. And sometimes I find, you know, the sort of positivity that you're forced to adopt all the time, you know, quite difficult. So I feel like, yeah, I'd like to be able to hold both, but at the same time still be part of this fantastic new flourishing, you know, that is happening around us. Yeah.
I mean, and to the, you know, we're so dynamic as humans, right? We don't need to be contained to single words, to single stories. Our imaginations are so much richer than that. As our final question for the conversation, we have a question from Olivia who would love to know from each of you, of our panelists, what is the first formative piece of art that impacted you? And so, Farhana, Geeta, and Andrea, just like how we earlier did it, we're going to do a quick rapid fire reflections on it. So Farhana, actually, why don't we go with you? Because you were just sharing some beautiful art.
Well, there is there's a Van Gogh there, and I think the sunflowers for me are just incredible. And knowing the story of the sunflowers, that they were painted in poverty with someone suffering from depression, and helped literally re-see the world and reimagine that is incredible.
Yeah, amazing. Geeta, how about you?
I was shocked by how quickly the answer popped into my head, and the art that as a child gave me a sense of connection to the world that we live in was actually the botanical gardens in my hometown of Austin, Texas, where I actually live again now after years away. And there is this beautiful Japanese garden where there's a stream that flows all the way through. There are these beautiful trees that shelter the whole garden. There are ponds with fish. And I remember as a child floating these boats down the stream. And we took my now 2-year-old son there for the first time a few months ago, and just seeing the joy that he felt going there. He loved the fish and he loved the stream. And it was just such a reminder that home is art, and we are surrounded by reminders of how important our world is. Art can be your front yard and a blade of grass. And so that having those connections as a child are really what gave me this sense of purpose with this work. And I hope for every child that they have access to that kind of the art of nature.
I love that. As a new mom, that really resonates a lot with me, Geeta. And Andrea, how about you?
Well, I was an early reader, and my dad approached me the Popol Vuh, which is the foundational story of the Maya Quiche people. So it's a storybook, but also it tells a really important story through metaphors that tell us that the Mayan communities, the Maya Quiche communities, we're alive because we grow our food, but because we take care of what our life allows, like the corn, the beans, the seed, the herbs. The Popol Vuh talks about how the corn plant was made to grow, how the people had contact with other communities for a long time, how the collective work, the collective word was the one that allowed life in planet, and how the problems can be solved through dialogue, through creativity, through art. So it's really important to me, that story was really important to me. It gave me a profound sense of our existence as Mayan communities. And also it has a lot of poetry in it that told me that the beauty in the way we tell stories are also important.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Andrea. Wanja, unfortunately, the time has come that we have to wrap up this conversation, but I am confident this is not the last of our conversation with this incredible community that has joined us today.
Yes. And just before we go we're about to invite you to something really exciting. But just before that, I wondered if we wanted to bring up Olivia, because Olivia, you talk about Warmth by Daniel Sherrill, which is a gorgeous, impactful exploration of climate grief and organizing. Did you want to talk about it, Olivia, or how do you feel about that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So to talk about Warmth specifically, I might have it next to me, actually. I have no affiliation with Daniel Sherrill. I just think it's a really beautiful book. It's called Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World, but it's not a doomist story at all. It's so beautiful and so focused on, he's writing to his future child. And so it's really this meditation on what it means to live for future generations. I think it's so beautiful and it gives me so much hope. Also, just thank you for having this space here, because I'm seeing just everyone in the comments. I'm so excited that these people are here. So thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you sharing that. So we are so excited for this conversation to continue, and we would like you to invite you to the Global Climate Storyteller Network. So this is basically a space that aims to bring new energy, ideas, and perspectives from all of us and all those who are working on climate-themed stories and projects. So it's basically a space for us as storytellers to access resources, platforms, share opportunities, work together and share our learnings, and really be part of a community. So please spread the word, and it's open to producers, impact producers, authors, writers, editors, all of us involved in this important and amazing work. So if you're interested in joining, please fill out the form. The link is just down there on the chat, and please just help us share it out and spread it out to our community of creatives.
Once more, we are so, so grateful for Vanessa, Farhana, Geeta, and Andrea for kicking off this conversation, for Jess X Snow for their amazing art that has complemented this series. Thank you to the incredible sign language team and String and Can for their live translations, to Mike Lindsay and the whole production crew that has ensured that this was a seamless digital experience for everyone that is tuning in from across the globe today, to all of our colleagues at Doc Society who helped make today's event happen. And finally, a huge thanks to both women at Sundance and the Sundance Film Festival team for this opportunity. We are so grateful for your curation and leadership. Thank you to each and every one of you who joined the conversation today. There are a couple other incredible climate themed storying panels that are happening throughout Sundance, including one that's happening at the Macro Lodge right after we wrap up right now. But yeah, we are just so grateful. It was so wonderful to see everyone's hearts, emojis, and faces. And we hope to be in person and in community with each and every one of you very soon. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.